Good evening and happy Easter. On behalf of the Notre Dame Institute for Church Life, Lenny and Jess, it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the fourth night of the lecture series, Dante, Mercy, and the Beauty of the Human Person. My name is Kevin Grove. I'm a Holy Cross priest and delighted to be able to introduce this evening's first speaker. Our university community, as well as our viewers online, have been making a pilgrimage through Dante's Divine Comedy this Lent and now Easter. And our reading coincides with the Year of Mercy, responding to what Pope Francis said about Dante. The Divine Comedy, he said, is an invitation to rediscover the lost or obscured meaning of our human path and to hope to see again the glowing horizon on which the dignity of the human person shines in its fullness. We resume that call once again with two lectures treating aspects of the Purgatorio and Paradiso. Tonight's format will be the same as the three prior evenings of lectures. After the first lecture, there will be a 15-minute break in lieu of question and answer, and as naturally has occurred, that break will be a time for discussion and conversation about the lecture. The second lecture by Professor Newsom Martin will follow at 7:15, and you may revisit these lectures on the ICL YouTube channel after. I now have the privilege of introducing Father Chase Pepper, our first speaker this evening. Father Chase works at King's College, a Holy Cross college in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where he is a lecturer in theology, member of the campus ministry staff, and a part of the residential life staff. Father Chase was ordained a Holy Cross priest last year here in our Basilica of the Sacred Heart after completing his theology studies at Notre Dame. In addition to his current work at King's College, Father Chase is also a regular pastoral visitor to a local men's prison in Pennsylvania. In addition to saying masses for them, Father Chase has started a Dante reading group for inmates that meets weekly during the Year of Mercy. This has become a highlight of the week, not only for the incarcerated, but for Father Chase. Father Chase has found the comedy is quick to provoke great conversations for those feeling a bit in exile partway through the journey of their own lives. He said to me that the group, quote, opens up conversations about such things as trust, how it's earned, how it's lost, how it's regained, friendship, where one can expect to find it, and what it takes to keep it, hope, how to tell the difference between being stuck in a situation one can't get out of and being challenged by a situation to become a freer person. I share that with you tonight because we are not only going to hear from a careful scholar and reader of Dante, but from one who practices readings of the comedy as an entree into substantive conversations about mercy each week. Father Chase's lecture is entitled, Uniting the Eyes from Fixation toward Fascination in the Easter Tuesday Cantos. Fittingly, on this Easter Tuesday, please help me to welcome warmly both my brother in Holy Cross and this evening's first lecturer, Father Chase Pepper.
Thanks again, Kevin. That was very nice of you. Incidentally, I was at the prison for the Triduum services, and they said, Father, are you going to be out here on Tuesday for Dante? Tuesday's Dante night. Are you going to be out for Tuesday? I said, oh, no, actually, I'm going to be gone this upcoming Tuesday. I've got a Dante lecture back at Notre Dame. And they said, oh, well, just make sure they know that your heart is here with us, and go Irish. So I say that in order to pass along the word to you guys. As Father Kevin mentioned, this is a fortuitous day to be reflecting together on Dante, mercy, and the beauty of the human person. Today, after all, is Easter Tuesday, and a significant part of Dante's journey in the comedy takes place on Easter Tuesday. Dante sets the Inferno during the Triduum of the Church's first Jubilee year, proclaimed by Pope Boniface VIII in 1300. There's some debate about the actual date. In the notes to his translation of the Inferno, Robert Hollander says that Dante's descent into hell could have begun on Good Friday, April 8th, because Easter Sunday actually fell during the Jubilee year on April 10th. But it could also be given the allegorical nature of the journey, that Dante sets out on Good Friday, March 25th, which Hollander says would be propitious because that's the anniversary, according to tradition, of the creation of Adam, of the Annunciation, of the actual crucifixion, as well as being the Florentine New Year. It would be not just propitious for Dante, but it would be propitious for us who ourselves observed Good Friday this year on March 25th, which means that today, Easter Tuesday, March 29th, 2016, would mark the 716th anniversary, both liturgically and according to the solar calendar, of what Dante was doing 5 days into his pilgrimage of mercy. Today is the 716th anniversary of Dante's passage through the 3 terraces of Upper Purgatory, the terraces of avarice and gluttony and lust, which we read about in Purgatorio, Cantos 19 to 27. So when I drew this date to give this lecture, I knew right away that I wanted to meditate on these themes of mercy and beauty and human personhood through the lens of Dante's experiences in Upper Purgatory. I didn't know what that exploration was going to turn up, but as I read and as I reflected, it pressed home on me that this is the eve of Dante's reunion with Beatrice, which is where Father Kevin Grove got us started with this lecture series a month and a half ago. We are on the threshold of what Christian Maves so beautifully describes in his book, The Metaphysics of the Comedy, as the one thing that can bring real change to Dante's life, namely Beatrice, which he then interprets as the self-unveiling or self-giving of the real, the riso dell'universo, the smile of the universe, a cosmic power of attraction or love so intense that it steals the mind and heart from themselves, teaching them the unutterable sweetness that is self-sacrifice, love, the surrender to the ground of one's being, of all being. With the unveiling of Beatrice on top of Purgatory, Dante will stand unanesthetizedly exposed to the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, the mystery both terrifying and fascinating that is God reflected in and as one of God's creatures. And Dante will be invited to recognize himself as one with what he sees. So Upper Purgatory is immediate preparation for this moment. Upper Purgatory is the final shaking free of all of those vestiges of fixated love that keep one locked into the fiction of being on one's own and for one's own in the world. Dante is going to try to shake us free from the drowsy and the false contentedness that we can have with the passing things of life. And so help us to see what he sees, to see as he sees, not by mere appearances, but by the fascinating truth of who we really are together, with and in God. And that is why the title of this lecture is Uniting the Eyes, from Fixation toward Fascination, in the Easter Tuesday Cantos. Before all that, though, I'd like to give you a little biographical note about how I have come to know and to befriend Dante in my own life. I started reading Dante 10 years ago exactly in the spring of 2006 during a study abroad semester that I was taking in Italy. It just seemed like the right thing to do. You're in Italy, you read Dante, bada bing, bada boom. Reading the Inferno for the first time was naturally exciting and haunting, kind of like a car accident that you can't tear your eyes away from. The Purgatorio wasn't quite as exciting as the Inferno, especially with all of that weird visiony stuff that takes place up in Eden, but it at least retained some of hell's graphic quality, the eyes of the envious sewn shut with wire, the fires of lust cast fiercer than molten glass. That's cool stuff. When I came to Paradiso, though, things changed. And more specifically, I came to Paradiso 2, where Beatrice is explaining moon spots to Dante. And I recall this so explicitly. I was on a train heading from Salzburg up into the Bavarian Alps. It was a gorgeous afternoon. I was reading my Dante, and all of a sudden, here's Beatrice going off about science experiments, and my reaction was kind of like more of a sound than words. But I thought to myself, that's not right. That's not how it goes. And that's when I decided to stop reading Dante. It's not for nothing that Dante warns his readers at the start of Paradiso 2, "You in that little boat who, listening hard, have followed from desire to hear me through behind my bowsprit singing on its way. Now turn, look back, and mark your native shores. Do not set out upon these open seas, lest, losing me, you end confused and lost." He was right. I was lost. But you don't say something like that to a college junior and expect him to take you at your word. My thought was just, I'm sure that's what all the poets say, I'll get by this. And I was wrong. Skip forward a few years. I was in my first year of seminary with the Congregation of Holy Cross here at Notre Dame, and I was taking an Old Testament course with Dr. Gary Anderson. There was a major research component to that class, and Dr. Anderson, having learned that I had at one point in my life studied Italian, invited me to study the liturgical geography of the comedy. It sounded creatively out of the box, so I agreed. And again, Inferno was exciting, Purgatorio was compelling. I had to read Paradiso, so I did, but this time something was different. Paradiso was inexplicably fascinating. It shone with a light that made me want to enter deeper and deeper into it. And from there on out, from reading Paradiso all the way through for the first time, Dante was a passion of mine. In time and with further study, I would learn to put into words what I had first found, what I started to find in Dante that took such hold of my imagination, and it is basically this. Dante shows us what it's like to share the same space. Dante shows us what it's like to share the same space. The blessed of Paradiso share the same space as each other. In other words, Dante imagines human relationships at their truest and at their liveliest as being inherently perichoretic, that is, interweaving, moving in and out of and through and around each other, like starling birds in an ever-flowing, patterned dance. Human relations are like this because the inner life of the Trinity is like this, perichoretic. Dante sees this dynamic for himself and he imitates it poetically when, in Paradiso 33, the ultimate canto of the comedy, he looks on God and he cries out in that moment, "Eternal light, you sojourn in yourself alone. Alone you know yourself, known to yourself, you knowing, love and smile on your own being. An intercirculation thus conceived appears in you, like mirrored brilliancy." Trinitarian being gives rise and is the model for all human being. So for Dante, in the words of Dante scholar John Tooke, quote, "Human relations too have about them ideally this same quality of mutual inherence, of one person's entering into the being of another as an inwardly operative principle of affirmation," end quote. To be a human person is not to have one's own ontological space in the cosmos. It is the ability to take in and to be taken in by another, who is really the horizon of any self that's worth speaking of. We see this idea of perichoretic relationship parodied all throughout hell. In the tempestuous coupling of Francesca and Paolo in the second circle of lust, which, incidentally, Dante also compares to starling birds in flight. In the contorted wheelings of the Florentine politicians who run together on the burning sands of the seventh circle, in the serpentine metamorphoses of Dante's in-laws in Circle 8's dark pouch of thieves, we see perichoretic relationship practiced in purgatory, in Dante's repeated attempts to embrace his newly arrived friend Casella at the base of the mountain, in the mutually supportive penance of the envious on the second terrace, in the affectionate cross-circlings of the lustful within the fires of the seventh terrace. And we see perichoretic relationship performed in paradise, in the language of in-youing and in-meing that Dante invents in order to converse with the troubadour bishop of Marseille in the heaven of Venus, in the two revolving crowns of souls that settle on Dante and Beatrice in the heaven of the sun, and in the voice of the eagle of Jupiter, which speaks as I and mine, while meaning we and us. So perhaps it wouldn't be too far off the mark to say that the comedy is a poetry of perichoresis. Now, this can sound all very high-minded, but at the heart of the matter, I think this is something that we get on an intuitive level. We already have an instinctive grasp of what Dante is trying to evoke in us. For anyone, for example, who asks questions of vocation, I think that this desire to share space with each other sits at the very heart of it. Those called to marriage celebrate this perichoresis in the most iconic and life-giving way. We say that man and woman become one. The vocation is not only to share life side by side in partnership, but also to reflect the Trinity in, to use another phrase I take from John Took, the total real presence of one person to another, which extends then into the paschal mystery of raising children with each other. For those called to priesthood and or consecrated life, I think that this desire is not really all that different. We don't share space in quite the same way, but the gift of celibacy is a focused ability to be stretched in the heart, so as to affirm your life as the gift that it is, to receive your life as the gift that it is, and to reflect Christ uniquely in that moment of human encounter. Celibacy is meant to foreshadow the sharing of space that happens in heaven. How are you called to share space with each other? Answering that question, therein lies a vocation. Our relationships unfold perichoretically not only in the discernment of vocation, that is, in figuring it out and living it well, but also in the practice of mercy. This makes sense on a root level when we stop to consider mercy as a type of compassion, as a feeling as you feel, and a seeing as you see, in the midst especially of experiences of suffering. On another level, though, as Walter Cardinal Casper argues in his book Mercy, mercy is a mirror of the perichoretic love of the Trinity. The Father models mercy by eternally, quote, giving space to the other in himself. God makes room in himself, as it were, for the Son. God makes room in himself, as it were, for creation. And the Son makes room for sinful humanity in the heart of God by going to the cross and laying bare his own pierced heart. At the cross, which we approach in the Eucharist and in the lives of each other, we become most truly one with each other. And as Casper says, quote, in becoming one with the other, love creates and grants space to the beloved, in which he or she can become themselves, end quote. Human beings imitate the mercy of God when we take up the crosses of our lives and join others at the feet of their crosses. This mercy, in both its corporal and spiritual works, makes present in near sacramental fashion the eternal, space-sharing love of the Father with the Son in the Holy Spirit. Now, this was pressed home on me very clearly one day in the seminary. In our second year of Holy Cross Seminary, which we call our novitiate year, my classmates and I would volunteer on Wednesdays as chaplains at the local hospital. And for the first several months, I would visit patients in the oncology ward. There was one day when I got called up to visit a guy named Levi. That was all that I knew about him when I knocked on the door. I entered the room and I found a young man, basically my age, asleep, emaciated, and paralyzed from the waist down by leukemia. This was my first encounter with a young cancer patient. Cancer always seemed like something far away and old, but this was my first encounter with a young cancer patient, and it shocked me. His family was there, so I made some small talk and I left. The following week, though, I saw that Levi was still admitted in the hospital, so I made a second visit. This time he was awake, and I was able to talk with him and get to know him a little bit. As we spoke, though, an interior voice kept creeping in on me, which asked, why is he in that bed and not you? Why is he in that bed and not you? Why is he in that bed and not you? And it eventually dawned on me, there is no good reason. Nothing meaningful separates us. And with that, I felt it in my core that Levi and I were somehow one. At the foot of the cross of leukemia, I could see myself in the life and the suffering of another. And the only thing that you can do in a moment like that is to love. That is how mercy can help us to share space with each other. It lays bare our own pierced hearts. It lays bare the terrifying yet fascinating mystery of our lives and raises us to the love that moves the sun and the other stars. So if human flourishing entails participation in the perichoretic love mercy of the Trinity, then an obstacle to human flourishing is the failure to share space with one another. Purgatory diagnoses these failures of reason and love and sets out a program of healing. In particular, upper purgatory sets before our eyes a series of fixated loves, or to use the words of Christian Maves again, stories of, quote, obsessive and habitual self-identification with the contingent finite objects of one's own experience. The shades of these upper terraces, far from sharing space in life, sought to consume it by taking into themselves to an immoderate degree the goods of this world, property, food, sex, the reason being that they experienced themselves as other than, as separate from the order of created things. Sharing space with other people takes faith. It takes courage. You have to trust that something or someone is there on the other side of losing yourself to hold what is most truly you together, and then to return you to that in ever truer form. In the absence of this faith, in the absence of this confidence, the alternative to losing oneself is seemingly to take to oneself as the guarantor of one's own safety and identity and rest. Dante's experiences in upper purgatory, then, reflect a way of being together that is as yet frustrated in its will to share the same space as each other. For example, the bodies of the avaricious do not move in any meaningful way with each other. They lie strewn and scattered among each other such that Dante and Virgil have to pick their way along with scant, slow steps. Human wills are not yet fully at peace in the divine will, and as such they can at times be in competition with each other. Leaving off from questioning Pope Adrian V at the avaricious pontiff's own request in Purgatorio 20, Dante remarks, "Against a better will can't well fight. And so against what pleased me, pleasing him, I drew the sponge still thirsty from the stream." Incidentally, I use Robin Kirkpatrick's translations for all of the quotes that I'm using. In line with this same passage, human intellects do not as yet intuit each other as they do in paradise, so Dante has to thirst for knowledge, and in a way to beg his daily bread by asking questions, by asking lots of questions from intermediate sources about the novelties of the mountain. Human encounters even seem to be on a lag on these terraces, a lot like YouTube videos with bad Wi-Fi. After the Roman poet Statius intersects and greets Virgil and Dante on Terrace 5, it takes 65 lines for Virgil to getting around to asking who this new guy is. And even when Dante finds his old friend Ferese on the 6th terrace of Gluttony, Ferese has to ask Dante multiple times for news about himself before Dante offers anything of substance. Purgatory is practice ground for perichoresis, so it only makes sense that the shades up here are still stepping on each other's toes. In Dante's view, the remedy to fixated love and the separateness from each other that results from this is not so much in loving rightly as in seeing rightly. Loving rightly follows from seeing rightly, as Beatrice tells Dante up in the 9th heaven, in the Primum Mobile. Throughout Upper Purgatory, Dante drops hints that the way that he sees is somehow off. He tells Guido Guinizelli on the 7th terrace of lust, for example, "I make this climb so as to be no longer blind." And in response to a question about what grace allows them to ascend purgatory, Virgil tells Statius that Dante, not having died yet, has to be led up the mountain because his soul's eyes as yet don't see as our eyes do. Most revealing, however, is the dream of the siren, which Dante has just before dawn on Easter Tuesday morning, while he's still asleep on the 4th terrace of sloth. Now at that hour, when daytime heat cannot, vanquished by earth and sometimes Saturn's rays, sustain its warmth against the chilling moon, there came, dreaming, to me a stammering crone, cross-eyed and crooked on her crippled feet, her hands mere stumps, and drained and pale in look. I gazed at her. Then, as to frozen limbs, when night has weighed them down, the sun gives strength. Likewise, my staring made her free, long-tongued to speak, and drew her in the briefest space, erect in every limb, giving the hue that love desires to her blurred, pallid face. It is Dante's own gaze that transforms the cross-eyed siren into an object of appeal. Far from recognizing a beautiful thing as being actually beautiful, Dream Dante exposes a tendency to fabricate beauty divorced from reality, to see by the light of his own projected desire, his own need to desire. This wouldn't be so bad if it was just a matter of seeing behind surface appearances and calling to the surface something of deeper inherent value, but that doesn't seem to be the case here. When the siren gets to talking, after all, she admits quite openly And Ulysses, entranced to hear my song, I turned off course. Rarely do those who've learned my ways depart. I bring them full content. The siren character is the appeal of surface appearances. She is the temptation to claim full content with the passing things of life, not the deeper things. She gives voice to this already present tendency in Dante, and for that matter, in us, to rest in mirages of our own making. And if this tendency remains unchecked in the waking world, then Dante would be in danger of holding himself up in patterns of apprehension and valuation that nobody else can truly join him in. This way of misapprehending and misvaluing the world of sense experience as a place to stake out, for better or worse, my security, my identity, my rest at the expense of true, genuine, perichoretic human relationship, that is what I am calling fixation. That's the word I'm using. Luckily, Virgil rescues Dante from the siren, but until fixation is confessed, until Dante, weeping, admits to Beatrice in Eden that mere things of here and now and their false pleasures turned my steps away the moment that your face had hid itself, her eyes remain veiled from Dante's way of seeing. There is another way of seeing, which apprehends God in all things and uniting all things, walking not by the light of projected desire, but by the light that makes everything else light. And this is what I am calling fascination. Peter Damian describes what fascination is like for the blessed, who see God directly by telling Dante in the heaven of Saturn, divine light drives its point upon me here, and penetrating that in which I'm wombed, its virtue, joined with my own powers of sight, lifts me so high above myself, I see on high the essence where that light is milked. Hence comes the brightening joy in which I flame. Dante himself describes what this can be like for those who see God through the media of created things, when in the first canto of the Paradiso he says, held in her, that is Beatrice's look, I inwardly was made what Glaucus, tasting grass, was made to be, consorting with the other ocean gods. To give even in Latin phrase a meaning to transhuman can't be done. Held in Beatrice's gaze, Dante is translated into a state of light and joy. Again, this isn't entirely foreign from what we're already familiar with. We can recall Thomas Merton's famous experience when, at the corner of 4th and Walnut, he awoke from his own dream of separateness and suddenly saw all those people walking around shining like the sun. Fascination recognizes the people and things of the present moment as reflections of and invitations to encounter with the perichoretic love mercy of the Trinity. It overcomes separateness in this epiphany that separateness is not meaningful to us. There are these moments on a street corner, in a hospital room, on top of purgatory, when the grace of fascination takes hold of us and lifts us above ourselves in the realization that we belong to each other after all. I do not think, though, that this grace is limited only to the extraordinary moments of life. There is a way of seeing and loving fascinatedly that pertains to the mundane. And this happens when God is habitually, but no less transformatively, apprehended in the events, the persons, the things of everyday life. Thomas Aquinas says that for human beings, there was a way for human beings to see God before the fall, and there remains a way of seeing God after the fall. It is clear that after the fall, he writes in his De Veritate, humanity needs a triple medium to see God. Creatures themselves, from which he rises to the knowledge of God, a likeness of God, which he gets from the creatures, and a light from which he receives the perfection of being directed toward God. So I'm not trying to argue that Dante was reliant on or even cognizant of this source when he was writing the Purgatorio, but I would argue that we can discern in Upper Purgatory a series of meditations on this triple medium, namely our value as creatures, the restoration of God's image and likeness in us, becoming transparent to the light of grace. And by these meditations, Dante moves us, even as he was moved, to recognize God under the guise of our own lives together. The instant that Dante and Virgil set foot onto the fifth terrace of avarice, we see in our imaginations what Rudolf Otto means in his book, The Idea of the Holy, when he speaks of creature feeling. That, quote, feeling of personal nothingness and submergence, end quote, that springs from direct, or rather less indirect, encounter with divine mystery. Dante writes, now loosed onto the circle number 5, I saw there people all around me who wept, each turned face downwards, lying on the earth. Adhesi pavimento anima mea, I heard them say this, but sighing deep, so what they said was hardly understood. The shades of the fifth terrace inhabit literally and wholly what we ourselves inhabit liturgically when we come to Mass on Ash Wednesday and receive the sign of the cross on our foreheads. They inhabit what I was able to experience for the first time this past Good Friday when I prostrated myself at the foot of the altar during the liturgy and called on the mercy of God. They don't just remember that they come from dust, they actually adhere to the dust. They cloak themselves in the symbol of the nothingness out of which God breathes his creatures into being, and they wet the ground with their tears. Perhaps it's possible for us to detect here an echo of Genesis's second creation narrative, wherein a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground, and the Lord God formed man in the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. In the words of Pope Adrian V, the first penitent Dante meets up here, the avaricious had in their lives fixed their eyes on earthly things and sought their rest among the lies of life. Consequently, God now keeps them bound in a posture of fixation. And Pope Adrian claims that the mountain has no pain more harsh than this. Now, I'll admit that when I first encountered this detail in the text, I was a little bit skeptical, because compared with the weights of pride and the fires of lust, lying down for a few hundred years doesn't sound that bad, especially if you're halfway through a college semester. Perhaps Pope Adrian says as he does, though, for two reasons. First, no pain is more harsh because it is meant to undermine humanity's most fundamental temptation, which even before denying our createdness is to forget that at each and every moment we spring by God's creative grace from nothing, and in that forgetting to mistake anything else created as something to be grasped at, even as something to be enjoyed, in the Augustinian sense of that word. Second, no pain is more harsh because it is meant to sharpen our most fundamental desire, which is to see God. In the 33rd chapter of Exodus, Moses asks to see the glory of God. The Lord responds to Moses, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by. Then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. For those who refuse even to see God's back, by making gods for themselves out of material reality, for those who refuse to apprehend God through created forms by fixating on the goods of sense experience, God in turn turns their backs to him. This is not an act of retribution, though. At heart, this is an act of mercy. God turns them not so much against himself as into the truth of who they are. Created forms, beloved nothings, who for that reason are free at their heart from any compulsion to compete for space or anything else in the present order of things. Inhabiting this nothingness may be the mountain's most painful punishment, but it is what enables them to see the light of heaven, not only among the stars, but also within themselves. When Virgil and Dante are preparing to leave the fifth terrace, an earthquake overtakes the whole mountain. Dante tells us that they were moving on from the shade of Hugh Capet when, as though things were crashing down, I heard the mountain tremble, and I felt the chill that all will suffer when they come to die. Delos itself did not so fiercely shake before Latona made a nest of it, to bring to birth the two eyes of the sky. Not knowing what's happening, it feels to Dante as if the mountain is collapsing. And if purgatory is collapsing, that would mean that the end of time is here. Naturally, then, Dante experiences the sort of fear that Jesus warns will attend that first unmediated encounter between God and humanity when God comes to judge the living and the dead. This is the fear that attended the harrowing of hell on that first Good Friday. This is the fear that Rudolf Otto describes as the wonder that strikes us chill and numb when we realize exactly what it means to be a creature. And in his memory of that fear, Dante draws an analogy. He recalls Delos, the floating island of mythology, which was subject to severe earthquakes before Latona, the mother of Apollo and Diana, came to give birth on it. The island finds rest when it becomes the nest of the two eyes of the sky. The classical allusion finds its biblical counterpart in Mary, whose fear at the message of the angel manifests her perfect lowliness, and as such preconditions her fiat, her yes to God's plan, and disposes her to conceive the light of the world. Just so, when the human soul shakes in recognition of its nothingness before God, it is poised just then to receive God's creative work. Its nothingness becomes the nest in which God separates the light from the darkness. It comes to rest in the light of grace that it finds within and shares with everyone else. Leaving the fifth terrace behind, the three poets now, Dante, Virgil, and Statius together, climb with ease to the sixth terrace of gluttony. This terrace anticipates the Garden of Eden, which Dante will reach tomorrow morning on top of Purgatory, Easter Wednesday. Emerging from the climb, Dante says, "We found there in the middle of the road a tree, its fruits in perfume good and sweet, and to the side, where rock walls closed our path, clear liquids streaming off the towering cliff, sprinkled across the surface of the leaves." There are two such trees on this terrace. In reference to the second, an unknown voice tells Dante that it has seeded from the original tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is in Eden still. The second tree, too, is attended by a group that raised their hands and called towards the leaves, I don't know what, like silly, overeager little tots who plead, although their target won't respond, but rather seeks to whet their appetite, dangling unhidden what they want aloft. St. Paul writes to the Philippians to have the mind of Christ, who, while he was in the form of God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped at. Here we are witnessing the healing of that grasping spirit, which in Adam and Eve extended too far, too quickly, beyond its creaturely limits, and thereby disfigured the divine image and likeness in them. At this point, however, we might ask Dante an uncomfortable question. Adam and Eve disfigured God's image when they ate the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, but in a way, the knowledge of good and evil is precisely what the comedy is purporting to hold out to us. In seeing and naming and speaking with both the truly dead and the truly alive, Dante, as it were, shares with us a fruit that promises to make us like God by giving us knowledge that only God has. How is it that Dante holds out to us what God first forbid, and this tereth now even withholds? Is it poisoned? Is it a trick? Is it a lie, as was the serpent's? This is an uncomfortable question. Perhaps one of the reasons why eating the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil led to the disfigurement of the image and likeness of God in Adam and Eve is because by that act of transgressing their creaturely limitations, they sought to know as God knows while remaining the subjects of their own knowing. They're the ones who are doing this type of knowing, not God. Rather than sharing in the knowing of the one subject of all knowing, God, they tried to objectify that knowledge and to pack it away into their own little subjectivities. And they fell apart under the weight of that. The severe fasting that is the penance of the sixth terrace restores this image of God by milking its penitents not only of their excessive appetites, their gluttony, but also of their false subjectivities. The souls here thirst to be known by each other and to receive the truth of each other's lives. They wear their names, not as expressions of their egos, but as revelations of God's grace in them. They know good and evil, not on their own, but in the knowing of God, as the crucifixion of Christ, as it plays out in their lives. Dante holds out to us the knowledge of good and evil in just the same way, as participating in the cross of Jesus. And that is why the comedy can help to restore the image and likeness of God in us, rather than tempting us in following him to repeat the sin of Adam and Eve. Dante pays a lot of attention to faces up here on the sixth terrace. In particular, he notes what the fasting of the terrace does to people's faces. When he first catches sight of these souls, he says that each one was dark and hollow round the eyes, pallid in feature, and so gaunt in waist, their skin was formed to show the very bone. Dante can't even recognize his old friend, Ferese Donati, until Ferese makes himself known to Dante by his voice. Their faces are unrecognizable as human faces, yet their humanity is writ large on what remains of them. Dante also tells us the sockets of their eyes seemed gemless rings, and those who read man's omo in man's face would clearly have seen the M in all of these. Omo is the Italian word for man, so the eyes make the O's and the bridge makes the M. The face spells out our humanity. The fasting of the terraces parses down that which limits our comprehension of the truth of our humanity as something limited and yet reflective of the divine. The Omo that Dante reads on Ferese's face, however, also resonates with the Ecce Homo of Pilate in John's Gospel. Behold the man. We're supposed to say the same thing when Dante shows the gluttons to us. Behold that man, Christ. In their penance, the souls image God, not just in the abstract, but also in the vivid concreteness of Christ crucified. Ferese admits as much when he tells Dante, I call this, that is our penance, pain, rightly I should say solace, for that same yearning leads us to the tree that led Christ in his joy to say Eli, when through his open veins he made us free. These are a sacramental people. In their bodies, they make present the broken body of the Savior, and they participate in the saving suffering of the cross. They still reach for the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, but they themselves become the fruit that gives knowledge of Christ crucified. Our own participation in the Paschal mystery is the grace that remakes us in the image and the likeness of God. Now, in the interest of time, we must leave the gluttons behind and make our way to the terrace of lust. This is my favorite terrace. I don't know if that's appropriate, but it is. Not only the poetry, but also the artwork that this scene has inspired create an impression not so much of pain, although there is pain, as of fluidity, fluency, transparency. Among the avaricious, for example, Pope Adrian made it clear that the mountain has no pain more harsh than theirs. Among the gluttons, Dante emphasized the appalling desiccation of the aerial bodies he saw. Among the lustful, however, Dante simply notes, I saw spirits walking there in the flames. And he leaves us to make assumptions about what that must be like. The shade of Guino Guinizelli mentions to Dante that he does burn in the fire, that there is shame in their self-accusations. But Dante's experiences of the souls themselves is more akin to how he'll experience the blessed in the lower spheres of paradise. The lustful appear as visions in and out of vision, as fish do going down to the water's depth. Their bodies circle and their voices intermingle in an enduring harmony of penance and praise. Dante can drink them in with his eyes and pour himself back out into them by his words and gestures. Far from diminishing these souls in any way, the fire quickens them, like atoms that are vibrating right to their fusing point, and it makes them light and charged enough to translate to their natural place of rest in the shared space of the Empyrean. The problem with lust is that it self-identifies too quickly with the body, and thereby obscures the light that nests in the nothingness of our created being. Christian Maves again tells us, quote, to see only the body is to fail to see it as the self-manifestation in the world of the ground of all being. It is to fail to recognize Christ, resulting in crucifixion. End quote. He notes how Dante in Paradise has become transparent to the light of his being, and how in purgatory Dante's body is still prone to break and to eclipse light, hence the repeated references throughout the Purgatorio to the shadows that Dante casts on the mountain. I think, however, that the focus of the seventh terrace has less to do with how Dante still breaks light and more to do with how Dante even now mediates light to those who have eyes to see. But in order for us to see this ourselves, we have to get into the textual fabric of these cantos. Dante sets the scene with the lustful at a very precise time of day, right before dusk. The sun was beating down on my right-hand side, its rays illuminating all the west, changing its face from clearest blue to white. And I, in casting shadow on the flame, made fire seem fierier. Then many shades I saw at that one hint while walking on, gave thought, and came, because of that, to say of me their say. So let us put ourselves into the position of the lustful. How would they be seeing Dante in this scene? Through his shadow, in his real body, silhouetted by the setting sun. When we see only the body in this life, we limit ourselves to seeing and loving shadow versions of ourselves. Without the shadow to intervene between them and Dante, though, the light from the setting sun would be right in the eyes of the lustful. The sun would actually cloak Dante in darkness, which would prevent them from seeing the self-communicating features of his face. Dante, instead, his shadow tempers the light and allows these souls to see Dante truly, through the ephemeral extensions of himself, in his relational spontaneity and immediacy, wrapped in light as in a robe. They see Dante as Dante will see Beatrice. No wonder then that they wonder, quote, as mountain yokels stand, no differently, in dumbstruck stupefaction, staring round when red-necked rough they make it first to town. The object of their previous fixation has become for them the locus, in Maeve's words, for the self-manifestation of the ground of all being. They detect the light of grace that has nested in Dante's nothingness, and by that light they can recognize themselves as one with what they see. By way of a conclusion, we have an idea of what it's like to see like this. Think of Our Lady of Guadalupe, who in 1531, a little more than 200 years after Dante died and perhaps had rejoined the orders of weeping and singing penitents, appeared to Juan Diego outside of Mexico City and imprinted her image on his tilma. We see her the way that the lustful saw Dante. We see her the way that Dante first saw Beatrice in Eden, through a consecrating veil, in her revealing body, transparent to the divine light of grace which pierces her through. And she is the integration of everything that we have been talking about tonight. A humble creature in whose beloved nothingness the light of heaven chose to nest and nurse, a preveniently restored image of God in whose sevenfold sufferings the solace of the cross draws near to us, a light of grace in whose eyes of mercy we are soaked up and conditioned to see light itself. Mary embodies the triple medium by which God may be seen by fallen humanity. Mary exemplifies the life of fascination that perceives God in the ordinary as well as the extraordinary, and she holds us in her view, loosening the knots of fixated attachment that weave their dream of separateness around us, restoring us to each other as brothers and sisters who can share the same space. Our eyes unite with hers, Dante's ready to unite with Beatrice, and in that gaze of fascination, we too find the mercy that makes us pure and prepared to rise towards the stars. Thank you for your attention.